Good morning to you, Umesh, from Ireland, and good evening to you in Melbourne. I really appreciate you taking the time to contribute and add your voice to the Inclusion Dialogue podcast. And we had a huge response from last year, but your name just kept coming up again and again as somebody who was key and influential working in inclusive education on a global stage. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me this morning. Do you mind if I start our interview with just asking you how you ended up working in this space? How did you end up framing your attitudes on inclusive education?
Thank you very much, Joanne. Good evening, and good evening to everyone who might be listening to this podcast. I think they might be listening in their cars or wherever. I think it's important to know how each one of us have come to this field. So I want to tell my story, how I came to inclusive education. And, sometimes you don't know why you came into this field, but then when you reflect back, you can say that's the story that might have influenced why I'm here today. I was in year 10 and I was suspended from my school for my behavior. And my behavior was I was not engaged in my classrooms. And so I'm talking about my story from India. And so when in India, most kids need to stay in class, listen to the teacher. And I'm sure, I think in many parts of the world, it's even still true now. Mm-hmm. But what happened, I found that was quite disengaging. And that was not, my learning style did not match with the teacher's teaching style. So what I used to do is after recess most days, I used to get truant. So after some time, my principal realized there are some kids who are not attending the school and they wanted to know who are those kids. So I was one of those kids, and then they found me, they suspended me, and they asked to get my parents to say, go get your parents. We want to know what's the reason behind. I couldn't go my home to tell my parents that I've been truant from school. But what I did realize that it did not work for me. So during that year, I didn't do very well in my studies, dropped out of school, and then I went to another school to study. So that was year 10. Year 10 is very critical in India. That's the time you decide what subjects you want to take, what stream you'll be, getting into. So when year 11 came, I did pass that year. I did write exams. I did very, very poorly. My scores were not very good. So what I did, I wanted to go back to the school. I said, can I get science? I was really interested in science. And my school principal said, but your marks are only 50% and you need to have 80% marks. So you can't get it. I said, okay. Then I realized for the very first time, it will affect my trajectory. So what I did, I asked my parents that I want to do science, but I want to repeat year 10. So no one repeats year 10. But my parents says, are you sure you want to repeat year 10? Because most people want to go forward. You are going backwards. I said, I'm fine. I want to go backward. Went back to the same school. Principal said, no, you can't stay here. And then they say, you need to go to another school. I went to another school, started studying there. But I also found some teachers who could understand my frustration with my learning. And that's where my journey started, actually, towards inclusion. And I always wondered why some kids flourish and others struggle and drop out. But it did not. And, so I did my year 12, got into bachelor's in intellectual disability. That's what we used to call it that time in India. And then master's in special education. Came to Melbourne University, and my project was looking at attitudes of school principals and teachers about inclusion. So that's how I got into this field. And I realized actually teachers, we blame most of the time teachers to say that their attitudes are negative or school leaders are negative. But I think the problem is not school teachers or leaders. The problem is with the university sector, people like myself who prepare those teachers. There's a problem with the policymakers and the policies. So I think if we fix teacher education, fix policymakers, provide them all the support, we can do we can change the system very much. And that's what I do. Most of my research is now looking at those. How do you do it? How do you know whether you have done it really well? And how do you go about measuring whether inclusion is working or not working, and what to do about it? So that's my story. How I got into
my favorite part of that story, Umesh, is that basically you kind of dropped out of school at some point, and you're now a prolific professor in this field. So I think that's really interesting, and it's not necessarily down to a special educational need per se or a disability. It's down to behaviour and frustration by the sounds of it. Did you know at the time that, like, you seem to have had quite a measured view of, my learning style didn't suit the teaching structure of the time. Were you aware of that, or were you at fault in your mind?
It's that's what I'm saying. It's a reflection. Like, when you look back at why I'm in this field, why I enjoy it so much.
Yeah.
So I think there is a student in myself who's always struggling with the system. And he keeps going back to those years. I said, then it's not only me, there are lots of other people who are struggling. So when I got into inclusion program, I was teaching in a special school.
Yes.
And I used to talk to kids, and kids will come and say, why can't we go to an inclusive school? Why can't we go to a regular school? These were the kids who could understand the problem with special schooling. Mm-hmm. They could see they get labeled here, but they say, we have potential. Why can't we get into in regular school? So I started reflecting back, is this the system or is this the student that we need to fix? And if we need not, I'm using the system to fix. It's perhaps not the right word, but I think we need to reform. We need to do lots of things like empower the system, also, mm-hmm. Educate the system, educate the leaders. But most importantly, the policy makers are the one where we need to work and do a lot of work, and teacher educators.
Yes.
And I come from India. I know it's a huge country, and inclusion is almost impossible. Like, when we talk about,
yeah.
But the reason is because we are devoting, or we have targeted the wrong sector. We are saying fixing schools wrong. Yes. I think that should not be our target. We should be fixing universities and university educators. Unfortunately, not many university educators realize that they need to change their practices. That's the problem. And I have written about it, what to do about that too. Sorry.
Can I ask you a little bit about that? You've done a little bit of work on the disconnect or the gap between university education for initial teacher education and I presume professional learning as well, right?
Yes.
And the practice on the ground. So maybe if you could explain to listeners, what's the problem, and then how do you propose as you say, reforming it or enhancing it somehow?
So the problem, in my view, when we talk about inclusion, there are two major problems in my view. When we talk about inclusion and how are we preparing our teachers for inclusion. First of all, the way we try to do it in some universities, they say, okay, if you want to be an inclusive teacher, you need to learn about these 6 things. 6 things, what they say is perhaps you need to learn more about intellectual disability, vision impairment, hearing impairment. And what we have done by doing this, we have made it even more problematic for teachers, because we say you need to learn a lot about different disabling conditions. And there are so many reports and research in the last few years where we know when students or teachers know a lot about disabilities, they become more negative about inclusion. They say, oh my God, it's not going to be easy. So that's the problem with the way we have structured our teacher education program. And I'm saying some universities have changed, but there are other universities where they are saying they're still moving in this particular direction. And I can tell you, I'm not just saying India, I'm saying worldwide. If you look at the curriculum of teacher education program, there are still many university programs where they'll still be covering a lot on what a student cannot do. What we are not covering enough is we're talking about the strengths of students, talking about how best we can change the system and provide the support to the student and to the teacher and to schools. That's what we don't do enough.
Yeah.
So I think this is where I think we are struggling. So one of the papers I wrote about is, if you really want to make our educators or our teachers prepare to teach really well in our system, we should work with their heart, hand, and head and hands. Yeah. So I talked about to say it's easy to say how do you change someone's beliefs, but it's very, very hard to do it in one subject. So the problem is you'll get a person like myself will get 1 unit to teach on inclusion. And then you expect that the teachers who are coming out of the system, they'll be ready to teach all learners who have different learning abilities or learning needs. While we do a good job of raising their awareness, we don't do really well to change their practices. So I would say we touch their heart to some extent. We provide them some knowledge about how to do it. But when they go in the real classroom, that's the hands, that's where they start struggling.
Yeah.
So we did a project where we thought, let's see how best we can, bridge this gap. So what we tried to do is we brought 2 classroom teachers who came and co-taught with us in the university. And we said, we talk about this inclusion all the time. And we said, this is how you should do it. But when our students or our pre-service teachers go to school, they struggle. So tell us how best we can do it. So they came and they talked with us. They said, these are the problems that we face as teachers. Can you cover those in your classrooms? So we try to do it. And then we work with those class students or pre-service teachers in the school. We supported them in those school settings. And what we found, actually, it made a huge difference in their understanding, their beliefs, as well as their practices. So that was a fascinating project. It was one pilot project we did, but we learned so much about bridging gaps between theory and practice through a program.
And can I ask, what did they present as being, what was the problem? What were the key issues that they wanted addressed in these courses?
So one of the problems, it's not a problem, most of the time when pre-service teachers will come and we start talking about inclusion, they will always think about the most difficult person that they would have come across in their life. They say, well, I have seen a student and this student had such high needs, or it's a challenging behavior. Yeah. And are you saying, Umesh, can we include that child in my classroom? So they will identify the most difficult student, and that's where they will start with. And I said, that's a wrong way to start about, when you start talking about inclusion. So the way I turn it around, I say inclusion is an opportunity for you. And why, I tell you. So think about yourself as a driver. If you learn to drive on easy roads all your life, like say, think about if you're driving in a country road, you'll be a very good driver. The moment you go in a city like London or, big city, and if you have to drive, you will struggle. There's so much traffic around this. If you have never driven on those roads, you'll never be a good driver. In my view. So you'll always be like L plate holder. What you need to do is, if you really want to be a good driver, you need to see this as an opportunity. Those students who have high learning needs, actually that provides you an opportunity to become a better teacher. That's how I see it. And I think to get this idea across takes time. Yeah. But once they start seeing inclusion is not about the students in their classroom, actually it's about them as teachers to become better teachers. They start understanding why they need to learn different teaching strategies, why they need to make their classroom more engaging, and how it's going to help them. So I say it's not about students, it's about you. So inclusion is an opportunity. I say, if you do it, you will enjoy teaching. You need to be, if you want to stay in this profession for next 20 years, make your life enjoyable. Learn those skills that that you will be able to do it really well in your classrooms. So that's what we do, or I try to do in classrooms.
And can I ask, did you notice any, I don't know if your study went this far, but what was the kind of outcome of that collaboration? What was the impact of it? Did you measure that in any way?
Yes, in the study that we published, I want to talk about two studies. So there was one study I did when I started my academic career at Monash University. So, when I talk about maybe second year of my university education or university teaching, very, very stressed out teacher like myself. I had to teach and I had 50 students in my classroom. One good thing I did, I started collecting data pre and post. And the data I started collecting about concerns about inclusion pre and concerns about inclusion after post. I looked at my content, and what I found, actually, the concerns of my students increased after I finished my teaching. So, after I taught my subject, I said, my God, if my vice chancellor came to know about this, he'll fire me. He said, Umesh, you are given a job to change these people's concerns or to make them better teacher, and they are becoming more concerned. Actually, should you be teaching in inclusion? And then I started, wondering what's happening in my classrooms. So one thing I realized, actually, the mistake I was making, spending too much time teaching about what's wrong with the student in your classroom, like what identifying disabilities, characteristics, why some students struggle. And then I started thinking, there's something wrong in the way I'm doing it. Then I was reading some of the research. Actually, there was a project written by Florian and Davies. There was a research done in UK where they looked at their special education pedagogy. And there are lots of other people have written about it. And there were many studies. I realized I need to change the way I do it. Came back, started changing things. So that's where I started doing things differently. I say, if I need to do things differently, then I said, there are three things I need to cover in my teaching. Why inclusion? How do I do it? And how will I know whether I've done it really well? So that's the kind of thing I started talking about. So not talking about students as much. It's talking about why should I do it really well? How will I know whether what kind of skills do I need to use in my classroom to include everyone? And when would I know whether I've done it really well? So that was the project. But the other project which you are talking about the partnership project, we had two classes. One set of students where we co-taught with them with secondary school teachers. The other cohort was taught by us, by university academics. And we looked at their data on their attitudes, their teaching efficacy, and their, I think, teaching practices as well. And we wanted to see whether there are any differences or not. And what we found, actually, there was a statistically significant difference in two cohorts. That's what we found. The group that was co-taught by us and secondary school teachers together, they were much better in terms of their attitudes, their efficacy, as well as the practices they were using in their classroom or in their school. So clearly, there were great benefits of the partnership with the school system. But it required a lot of planning, a lot of resourcing. But I think it worked really well for us, as well as for our graduate students, and I think for the secondary school students as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're kind of bringing us nicely onto kind of another topic I'd love to talk to you a little bit about, and it's possibly overlooked, in inclusion dialogue, is measurement. And that how do I know when I've reached that goal? How do you know what does inclusion look like, and how do you know when you've gotten there? So could you talk a little bit about your work in that area?
Yeah, so that's an area where, again, we start thinking about how do schools know whether they are doing it. I mean, they have created an inclusive classroom for all students or not. The way most of the time we have done is we ask teachers, do they have good attitude, or they feel good about inclusion. What we have not done really well is we have not spoken to kids or students in the school system. So if you look around, there is not much published. So we do talk about student voice is important, but when we look around, there are not many papers published. How do you do it? And Mel Anscott talks about, when inclusion works, 4 things must happen. He says students should be attending, they must be participating, they must be achieving, and they must be accepted. So I added 2 other things. I say, actually, they should also belong, and they must feel happy. So there should be 6 things happening for a student. Find a scale where students says perception of inclusion from their point of view. Do they feel whether they are included or not included? So they say, I'm in some maths class or in German class or, English class, and they report their own perception of inclusion in a school. I believe we need to have those kinds of system or those kind of, indicators in schools where we start almost in all schools, we should say universalize it. We should mandatory requirements for school to say, are all students in your school included? Not just students who have high needs or low needs.
Yeah.
Because if you know that students are included, like they have sense of belongingness, sense of happiness, because we know that's very important for anyone to learn, then we know they are participating, attending, accepting. So in my view, that's what we should be happening. Yeah. So we have published a paper where we designed a scale that can be used by schools to find out whether they are including students or not. Another important thing that I don't think many people have done is we talk about parents all the time. Parents' voices are very important. But you'll be surprised, is there a systematic efforts made by anywhere in the world where we capture parents' voices about inclusion, about their child? No. Even though we talk about it all the time.
Yeah.
So that's another project we have just started more recently. We have just published a scale, or not published, we started collecting data where they talk about perception, their own perception about their child's inclusion. So it's they are providing, do they feel that their child is included? We use all those 6 dimensions of inclusion, but they're talking about their child or their son or their daughters. They want to say, in my view, my child is included. So these are the 2 aspects of inclusion I think are very important. But then we have written a lot about how do you go about, what are the indicators of inclusion at the systems level? Like, are the policies inclusive? You have written about, Joanne, about resourcing. How do you really resource inclusion? Resourcing does not mean more money. Resourcing means how do you use the money to make inclusion happen? So as you have written about it, we have written about staff development, as so people talk about input, process, and output. So we just finished a paper writing about what are the things that you need to measure in input, process, and output, and what are some of the questions that different people can ask, whether they are doing it or not doing it really well. So that's what in my view is important for us to talk about.
And it's the multiple voices, like you said. my final question, Umesh, is kind of related to what you said at the very beginning, and it's really about the kind of political will and the policy aspect and how instrumental that is to make all the other aspects of the system work. So say you have this kind of much needed data, hard data, which policymakers love, around measurement and inclusion from multiple voices. So, and equally, my colleague in the School of Education here in Trinity, Michael Shevlin, constantly talks about the policy disconnect between the research and policy disconnect. So how do we bridge that gap? How do we inform policymakers and actually genuinely impact change at that upper level?
I think it's extremely important for us to do it, but I think we need to do it in a way where we sit on a round table. We don't sit across the table. And I think what we need to say, most of the time researchers say, we know how to fix your policies. Policymakers say, you do not understand our world. So I think we have this tension. If researchers really want to work with policymakers, first of all, we need to say where they are coming from, and they need to understand where we are coming from.
Yeah.
Because research is very hard for us to translate into policies, like into school systems. So policymaker says, we have this policy, please help us to translate this thing. And they say, what are the evidence-based practices that our schools can employ? I say, I can tell you all about evidence-based practices, but the problem is how will you translate that evidence-based practice in your schools? And that's where they struggle. So I would say what we need to do, researchers, rather than telling them this is the best practice, we should tell them, how will this practice translate into your school? So what is this that you require for this evidence to translate into your school? So this is where we should be working now. So what we need to say is, if these are your kinds of schools we have, and one other thing that we are talking about is that we should be helping not one teacher to change, we should be helping the whole school community to change. It's about collective efficacy. It's everyone in the school should be empowered with the new skills, and those practices need to be sustained. So, what we need to do is help policymakers to get this thing clear in their head, that policies are only do one thing. They only tell you what to do. Policies will not tell you how to do it. This how to do things is very important. We know the best practices all around the world, but how requires for us to work with them and help them to move from where they are now to the next stage by providing them the tools that might help them, and perhaps start with some pilot projects. So if you have, say, 500 schools, policymakers will say, yeah, I like your idea, can you do it? I say, if I'm a really good researcher, I'll say, don't give me 500 schools to start with, give me 5 schools. I'll show you the evidence, and then we can roll it out in a larger scale. So go for a staged approach or a tiered approach of implementation.
Yeah.
So I'm talking about lots of ideas, but I think still makes sense where I'm coming from.
It's the roundtable idea is the key. I think you're absolutely right to impact any real change. Umesh, I've really touched the tip of the iceberg in terms of what you've done. Is there anything that you'd like to raise with listeners who would consist of students, policymakers, academics alike? Is there anything you'd like to add to our conversation here?
I think just one thing for me, inclusion is an opportunity not only for students who have high needs or low needs. Inclusion is needed now. If you look around the world, whole world needs inclusion. But if we cannot start that journey in our schools, whether it's in a kindergarten or a primary school or a secondary school, it will be very, very hard for us to move forward. So from my point of view, for teacher educators, I think it's our responsibility to make sure that our students understand this is an opportunity for them to become better teacher, better parents, better person in the society. So, and then we can move forward with this agenda. Don't make it too hard for students. I think most important thing is we tend to make it so hard, teacher educators, when we talk about inclusion. We need to make it simple. And one thing I told someone, I was doing this keynote in Bangladesh. They say, well, tell me, if you have to say, if I don't know anything to do inclusion, how will I include a child? I said, what will you do if your child became a student, if your own son or daughter came to your classroom, and if you have to include, what will be the pedagogy you will use? So when everything fails, use your heart to guide your pedagogy. I think that's where things make a lot of difference.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Umesh, can I ask you, where can somebody find out in detail about your work? Or is there any websites or anything like that you'd like to guide people to find out a little bit more?
I think the best way to look for me is Umesh Sharma, Monash University, or you can go on Google Scholar where you can look at all the papers that I have published.
Perfect.
But if anybody is interested, they're always most welcome to write to me. My email address is umesh.sharma@monash.edu.
Yes, thank you so much for a really interesting chat. I really appreciate it. Thanks a million, Umesh.
That's great. Thank you very much.